Think crashing a country's economy takes a war or natural disaster? Think again. Sometimes it's just a mix of greed, corruption, and the perfect storm of bad decisions. Throughout history, entire nations have crumbled not because of armies or earthquakes, but because of choices, misguided, reckless, and sometimes bizarre. Inflate the money supply until it's worthless. Step 1. Print money. Lots of it. It might sound simple, but this is how you send a country spiraling into economic oblivion. Take Zimbabwe in the 2000s. President Robert Mugabe's government faced mounting debt, political chaos, and a crumbling infrastructure. So what did they do? Print more money. And when inflation skyrocketed to 89.7 sextillion %, citizens found themselves billionaires by name, but broke by reality. A loaf of bread cost billions of Zimbabwean dollars, and people literally weighed their money because counting it was pointless. Funny? Sure, if you weren't living through it. But let's not forget the Weimar Republic, Germany's own nightmare after World War I. In the 1920s, the German government faced crippling war reparations and economic devastation. Their solution? The printing presses worked over time. In 1923, inflation spiraled so wildly that families burned cash for heat. Hyperinflation isn't just a financial disaster, it's the foundation for societal collapse. Borrow until you can't pay back. Step 2. Borrow. Keep borrowing. It's not your money anyway, right? That's the logic that brought Greece to its knees during the European debt crisis. Between 2009 and 2018, Greece borrowed its way into economic disaster. The debts mounted, and the European Central Bank bailed them out. But at what cost? Austerity measures gutted public services, pensions were slashed, wages plummeted, and ordinary Greeks took to the streets. Riots erupted in Athens, flames licking the steps of parliament. When a country owes more than it can repay, its sovereignty hangs by a thread. But the most shocking part? It wasn't just Greece. Entire swaths of the Eurozone teetered on the brink, and the world watched, holding its breath, wondering, would the entire European Union collapse over bad loans? Fuel speculation and let it explode. Step 3. Fuel the speculation. Create a bubble. Get people excited. When the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, trillions of dollars in market value evaporated overnight. Companies that had been worth billions were suddenly worth nothing. But it wasn't the first time this had happened, and it wasn't the last. Take the U.S. housing crisis in 2008. Banks handed out mortgages like candy, fueling a housing market so overinflated it was practically radioactive. When the bubble burst, the fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old financial institution, collapsed, and the U.S. economy plummeted into recession. Unemployment soared, homes were foreclosed, and the panic spread globally, tipping economies around the world into turmoil. Millions lost their jobs, and for what? The allure of easy money, and the delusion that what goes up doesn't have to come down. Cut off trade, make enemies. Step 4, isolate yourself, cut off trade, turn your friends into enemies. Venezuela, once one of South America's richest countries, offers a tragic example. In the early 2000s, Hugo Chávez's socialist policies relied on nationalizing industries and cutting off foreign investors. Oil, the country's lifeblood, was tightly controlled by the state. But when oil prices collapsed, so did the economy. Imports dried up, and with them, basic goods. Citizens found themselves in line for hours just to get toilet paper. That is, if they could find any. As the shortages worsened, the government doubled down, cutting trade ties and making things worse. By the mid-2010s, Venezuela was in freefall, with inflation skyrocketing and poverty rates exploding. And yet, Chávez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, continued to push policies that isolated the nation even more. The result? A country on the brink of starvation, millions fleeing, and a once prosperous economy reduced to rubble. Corruption, chaos, and cronyism. And now, the final step: corruption. Fill your pockets and empty the country's coffers. Argentina's economic collapse between 1998 and 2002 is a textbook case. Years of corrupt governments had mismanaged the economy, and by 2001, the country was on the verge of bankruptcy. The government defaulted on $132 billion in debt, and the peso, once tied to the US dollar, was suddenly worthless. Riots broke out, looters stormed stores, and President Fernando de la Rúa had to flee his palace by helicopter. The country went through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. It was absolute chaos. Why? Because politicians had lined their pockets while the country spiraled into disaster. From Russia's oligarchs to Argentina's kleptocrats, corruption is often the catalyst that turns an economic downturn into a full-blown crisis. So there you have it. You don't need a war or a natural disaster to destroy an economy. All it takes is a perfect storm of greed, bad policy, and a little corruption to tip a nation into chaos. From hyperinflation to crushing debt, from isolation to speculation, crashing a country's economy isn't just possible, it's happened time and time again. And the results? Devastating, catastrophic, entire nations left in ruins. So, next time you hear the economy is in trouble, remember, things can always get worse.